want to welcome everyone back to the final session, and we decided that we would do the final session more of a panel with our Festspace project. So I know Andrew's mentioned this at the beginning, but my name's David McGilvray and I'm the project lead for the Festspace, which is a HERA funded project, just like we've heard of a couple of others here today. Festspace is one of them. So we just want to spend the last 50 minutes discussing maybe some of the work that we're doing, setting out a bit of context for the project. We'll hear from 4 of the 5 partners, just giving us a little update on what they've done, what their findings are at this point, and then we're going to finish with a little discussion about the impact of COVID-19 upon the way in which this research is developed, and maybe that will lead into a discussion of how it's developed for everyone else who's part of the call. So just a bit of context just at the start, just to say what Festspace is, and hopefully you can see the screen in front of you. This project is said as a HERA funded project, and we are obviously interested in the relationship between festivals and events and public space. And as we've heard already today, that's quite a wide topic area. So I just thought we'd point to some of the research questions here on the right, top right, which are those that govern the project at the beginning, and maybe towards the end we'll discuss how maybe some of those are having to adapt. So we were interested in the types of festive space that exists, and this is a cross-European project, how festivals and events affect who uses these spaces, and we are including some indoor spaces as part of that, libraries, for example, which Bernadette Quinn will talk about, and also how people interact in those spaces. And also, I think important for us was the longer term, the enduring effects on issues of inclusivity around about festivals and events staged in these public spaces. You can see also the 5 partners, so University of the West of Scotland, based looking at Glasgow context, University of Westminster in London, University of Gothenburg, Christina Lundstrom, who's unable to be with us today, Bernadette Quinn from Technological University Dublin, Dublin's another focus, and Alba Colombo in Barcelona, and we have Michael, who's going to discuss the focus of that work in Barcelona with us today too. We'll talk about these as we go through, but we're trying to kind of approach this in terms of using particular methods. So although these differ a little bit between each of the individual project partners, we're doing kind of mapping exercises of the type of festive spaces that exist and the types of festival and events, and you'll hear a bit more about that from each partner. Kind of a lot of visual and auditory work around about at least partial ethnographies, where we're in and spending time within the public spaces and also in and around the festivals and events, and you'll hear a little bit about those, and maybe some more traditional methods. But we also have a range of associate partners. So each of the university partnerships have associate partners, which is intended to take us closer to maybe impacting policy, or at least affecting policy in some level, or practice in respect of the way that festival organisers operate in this space. And so they help us, I feel like, to also develop kind of interesting methods. And for example, we'll talk about that with our project in Glasgow, where we're working closely with urban designers, and that's happening in other spaces too, just to get a real sense of how decisions are made, and also about the way in which these spaces are themselves designed. So that's just a little introduction to the project. You can find us if you look in front of you, and it's been shared already, but you can find us at our website, festspace.net, and Festspace1 is the Twitter handle, which again is being shared quite a lot this afternoon already. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then I'm going to ask first of all Bernadette. So we're going to just ask each of the partners to give us, about 7 to 8 minutes on firstly about the festivals in their case study city and the focus of their particular project, so which events and which spaces they're focusing upon, and also the research that has already been conducted and what maybe some of the initial findings are from those projects. So I'll hand over to you first, Bernadette, if you maybe want to just give us a summary of those 2 questions, and then I'll move on to Andrew and Michael. You need to be on mute, Bernadette.
Okay, thank you, David, for that introduction, and thanks, Andrew, for organising the session. We've had a great morning, I think, so far. Okay, so we have an involvement in the HERA project in that we're working on Dublin as one of the cities. So just to give you a little bit of background about the study city, I should say that my colleague, Dr. Teresa Ryan, is on the call. So she might chip in later on maybe with helping me with some questions if the need arises. So Dublin is a city where festivals and events have proliferated recently, and where they're definitely being strategically used to a greater degree than they were before to further a range of different kinds of ambitions. So the local authority, Dublin City Council, produced an event strategy for the first time in 2018, in late 2018. And so that's obviously a key player in the city, the local authority. While it produced a strategy only quite recently, it has actually been investing in festivals and events for a long time through three main strands of activity: through its City Arts Office, through its community events unit, through its community unit rather, and then through its events unit. So there's a great deal of experienced practice, evidence, you know, in really strong internationally acclaimed arts festivals, for example, and in some really excellent community events that go on in districts across the city. But there's a little bit of a mismatch there between the practice that we know has been going on and the strategizing around that practice, or at least, you know, building an awareness of that practice in the public realm, which is one of the things that we're trying to do with this project. And because it's the capital city, of course, there are other key players behind events in the city as well, and they have perhaps different rationales behind their involvement to the City Council. One of the biggest and most obvious agendas at play at the moment in the city is the tourism one, and festivals and events are definitely being used strategically in the city to extend the season, very obviously, and to develop the city's brand in line with tourism marketing objectives. Now, there are tensions at play here, if you look at all closely, and these are only being exacerbated by the current pandemic. So that's very much on our radar in the background as part of the context. Strategically and coherently at an overall city level, it's actually quite difficult to figure out, you know, to develop an overall sense of what's going on in the city in terms of how festivals and events are officially valued. So we're trying to build up a better understanding of the policy landscape and the policy rhetoric around festivals and events coming out of the key players, and trying to tie it all together to see where events and festivals sit in the city context. So it's one of the things we're trying to address. We have two strands to our work. Firstly, we're focusing on 8 spaces in the city that Dublin City Council has named as spaces in its strategy document where it would like to see events prosper. So in the main, we're trying to understand how festivals and events help make and remake the city, and how festivals and events help make and remake public spaces, and the role that events play in helping people connect and identify with their city and its public spaces, and how they help people feel included. So far, we have gathered data in 4 of those spaces named in the Dublin City Council strategy document. We're using mixed qualitative methods, and we have a plan to engage with a variety of actors involved in designing, producing and consuming events in those spaces, and, you know, who are designing and producing those event spaces themselves. So far, the data we have gathered mainly comes from people participating as audiences. So in a way, we've been fortunate in the COVID context in that we've been talking to the public in public spaces mainly now up to this point. We've also got some data coming in from festival organisers and from local authority people, and we need to do more of that. And then the type of festivals that we've been looking at, they vary, because we're really focusing primarily on understanding the spaces. So we've been looking at 3 broad categories of festivals so far: music culture as one, family-oriented community as a second, and then ethnic festivals as a third. So we're trying to capture the diversity of festivals and events that are happening in these event spaces. We have a second strand to our work then as well. We're focusing specifically in our second strand on commemorative events, because Ireland is in a decade of commemorations at the moment, and we're trying to understand the meanings that people take from commemorative events and the importance that they play in remembering and in encouraging reflection. And the commemorative events that we're studying, as David mentioned, they're actually in indoor public spaces, mainly libraries. So this is complementing our work on outdoor public spaces. So in terms of emerging findings, just very briefly, We've been looking at Smithfield Square, St Patrick's Park, Merrion Square and Meeting House Square in the city so far, just in case people know the city. And some of the events that we've studied so far are Chinese New Year, the Hotter in July Music Festival down in Smithfield, Stokerland, which is part of the Bram Stoker Festival at Halloween, the Dublin Homecoming, as in the celebrations around the Dublin football team last year, and then Culture Night, which happens annually in the city. In terms of indoor events, we've been looking at the big War of Independence exhibition that happened in Pearse Street Library last autumn, and we've been looking at various libraries, local libraries as well, in terms of what they've been doing around the commemorative programme. So in terms of what have we been finding, up until March, as I say, we'd gathered data at 5 festivals in 4 outdoor spaces and 3 different types of festivals. And our findings firstly point to a wide range of evidence to show that festivals play a positive life-enhancing role. Festivals, as Andrew said this morning in his opening comments, democratize space. They make space inviting and livable. They create opportunities for people to bodily embrace the city. And we will definitely be arguing that through our findings. You know, they break down a distinction between a city and its people. You know, the city is its people, if you like. So we'll be definitely arguing that. But the bigger question then that we are still working on is, you know, do they do this for everybody? That's the question that is much more complex, if you like. Our findings about inclusivity are not very conclusive at this stage. We're not encountering tensions like some colleagues are in other cities like London, for example, but we do expect to see that more once we start talking to different kinds of actors. Remember, we've only talked to audiences so far, but once we start to talk to residents, for example, we'll probably see more tensions. But rather what's coming out of our data, I would think, is that we're seeing clear distinctions between, you know, inclusion and participation, which is looking very positive, and then absence and invisibility of other cohorts of people. So in particular, for example, our participants so far are very white. Now, we don't quite know why this is yet, and we need to look much more closely at, you know, what is it about a festival space that makes it open and inviting and available to be owned, and not some distant, unavailable, impossible kind of entity. You know, is it to do with the space itself, some tangible or intangible dimension of the space itself? You know, its location, its reputational dimensions. And we've heard a lot about myths today, which I think will be something that we'll be looking at. Is it related to the festival organization, their strategy, their programming, their costing, for example? Or is it something to do with the city governance of festivals? We are digging into this really complex set of issues to try and look at this question of inclusivity. So as I say, we are seeing a lot of positivity, and in that we are seeing a lot of inclusion around age, gender, class, for example, in the festivals we're studying. But beyond asking who is included, we also need to analyze the data and ask how are people included? You know, what does it actually mean to say an event is inclusive? You know, what does this actually look like? So we're trying to look at our data to have people tell us what do they feel it is to be included. And maybe one idea emerging, but it's only beginning to emerge, is that, you know, a person's connectivity to a festival is closely bound up to their relationship with the city more generally. And this is picking up on what Anna and Chloe were talking about earlier on, this idea that we have to understand festivals and the processes that shape them in terms of the wider processes shaping society and cities more generally. So, you know, we're seeing that, you know, a person's starting point into a festival, maybe as a first-time visitor or a newly arrived new resident, you know, it is about them trying to learn more about the city. Whereas a longer term resident is connecting to the city because they're remembering something about the city through their participation in the festival. So we're trying to find out more about what it means to say that people are included. And we're thinking about this idea about how they are related to the city more generally. But our findings are only very partial so far. So I'll hand over at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bernadette. Okay, so there's some key points there that I think we'll come back to in the two or three other speakers and then open up for discussion. So maybe hand over to Andrew next. Maybe wants to give us a quick summary of the work that you've been doing in London.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Bernadette. I'm going to sort of share some of our work in London with Goran. So Goran's also going to contribute to the discussion. So I'll certainly start. So yeah, as a case study, London hosts an unimaginably large number of festivals and events. And a bit like Dublin, we're particularly interested in the way the city has invented and continues to stage festivals which are deliberately aim to celebrate the city's sort of ethnic diversity. So there are lots of things happening, for example, in Trafalgar Square, like Africa Day and Diwali and these sorts of events, which are, you know, some people question, maybe they're a little bit tokenistic and there's issues with them, but we're interested in those sorts of events that almost deliberately aim to try and pursue an inclusivity agenda via the medium of festivals and events. But that's only really a secondary interest for us. We decided very early on that our main focus would be on park events. Why, you might ask? So number one, London is sort of famed for its parks. You may know that now London has become the world's first sort of national park city. It's a sort of, and that sort of, I mean, it was slightly a self-engineered award, but that award was partly in recognition of the role that parks and green spaces play in the UK capital. We're also interested in parks because they are used very frequently and very intensively for festivals and events, and often used quite controversially for festivals and events. So parks are notoriously contested spaces anyway, and when they're used for festivals and events, they almost become even more contested because certain festivals, particularly when they're gated, when they're ticketed, when they're expensive, they become quite disputed uses of parks, and some people think that they are not appropriate settings for very large scale events. And obviously I have a slight personal obsession with parks, which meant that was probably the main reason why we chose parks as well. But there was a rationale there for focusing on parks and park events. And we focused the research on two levels. So we were originally going to do two very detailed case studies. But we decided, again, quite early on, before the COVID-19 crisis struck, to actually do one very detailed case study, which Goran will tell you about, and then focus the rest of the research more at the London level, so try and get a more general picture of what was happening in London's parks. So earlier this year, I don't know if you sort of followed it, but we published a report, which was sort of one of our first sort of outputs, really, of the research, where we'd actually asked all the parks friends groups in London, of which there are lots, and they're quite a significant stakeholder now, about the festivals and events staged in their parks, to try and work out what was happening, you know, what the range of events that was happening in their parks, but also what some of the attitudes and some of the issues were with those events. So you can read that report, and again, obviously it was just one stakeholder's perspective, but it sort of started us off on this journey about getting a really good overview of what was happening in London. Where were the contentious events? Where were the juicy, interesting case studies that we might want to follow up in future research? And yeah, the second part was really a very detailed analysis, or the second level of the research is a very detailed analysis of one park, Finsbury Park in North London, which has become quite a famed case of where a site is used for a series of music festivals every year, which have become very, very controversial, alongside a really interesting program of other events too. So we decided this would be a really good case study, not because it was necessarily typical. It's not a typical park, and it's not a typical in terms of its very intense program of events, but we thought it was a case which could really tease out some of the essential issues that we were really interested in looking at. So because Goran's been doing most of the hardcore field work, I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about the Finsbury Park part of the work.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So I just also want to share, to say that I shared the report, the link to report in the chat. So please do have a look at that. But yes, so as Andrew mentioned, so we focused on Finsbury Park, and we actually aim to conduct a year in the life of Finsbury Park study. However, we managed actually to do 7 months really, So we started in August 2019 and had to stop in March 2020. The way we did this was also through, yeah, we can use like different, well, qualitative methods. So we use weekly day-long observations in the park to capture park in both everyday mode and its events mode too, because this was really important for us in order to understand how this space is affected by the festival. We need to understand how it is used in everyday mode as well. So that was crucial for us as well, and to our approach. So observations were done by those structured walks at the beginning and at the end of every day, and just spending time in the park. I forgot, sorry, I wanted to share, I had a few slides, so I'm going to try and do that too now. Sorry about that. It's not coming up. I don't know why I can't see we even tested it this morning. Sorry about that. Oh. No, I can't seem to share PowerPoint. So I guess I'm going to continue without it. So yeah, basically, so we try to absorb ourselves in life of park. So we took part in talks, in walks, in public meetings, in events such as Park Run. We also did a participatory mapping activity with users of the park, and this was done during Finsbury Park's 150th anniversary event. We also attended some other larger events and festivals, such as Hospitality in the Park, which is the leading drum and bass music festival in the UK, and also another kind of park, which is La Clave event, and that's London's free Latin music and culture festival. Yeah, I'm still going to try and do this, but okay, so I think it's going to work now. I don't know why this happened earlier and what happened. So this was just, yeah, loads of images from that participatory mapping event that I mentioned that we did before. So after that, we started interviewing key stakeholders, and this is still being done. And so far, it's being done online, and so far we've done 16. So just kind of, again, briefly, just some of the emerging findings. Well, what was kind of really interesting is that quite a few people, because we also spent, when I said we did observations, spending time in the park, we also talked to and did those ad hoc interviews with the actual users. So quite a few people described the park as not the most beautiful one, which was also quite interesting and surprising. But then they would add and say, but it's convenient, it's good to have nearby, and it's also very interesting because it consists of these different areas and different spaces, which are providing then opportunities for various everyday use, but also for various activities and events. And this was certainly the case in terms of variety and numbers of events. So there are regular organized walks in the parks, there are food growing and urban foraging related activities, there are regular drumming lessons, and also dog training classes. There is a wide range of organized sport activities as well, and some kind of more obvious one, but also these sport activities include baseball, American football, volleyball, Tai Chi, yoga, and also something called slacklining, which I haven't really heard about before going to Finsbury Park. But also there are various activities aimed at children and families. So it is really family orientated park or part of the parks. And this also includes the amazing Pedal Power Cycling Club, which is actually aimed at children and adults with learning disabilities. And so all of these events, and in particular these program activities, do make Finsbury Park a more inclusive space with a diverse range of people visiting and also having a reason to spend time in the park. Similar could also be said about music festivals on one hand. So in a sense that they are adding to this diversity of users, absolutely. And one great example is that already mentioned La Clave Festival, which is bringing together and to the park London's Latino communities, and also Latino communities are diverse themselves as well. And also to celebrate and share with everyone their culture. And because it's being free to access and without any fences around it, I mean, that was one of the reasons why it was also, and it's really interesting, festival, it was perceived favorably by most people we talk to. However, some other music festivals and also do raise many issues, especially in Finsbury Park, and mainly by being heavily fenced off, by being expensive, also occupying parts of the park for a certain period of time, including the setup time as well, and often are even causing a physical damage to turf, but therefore disrupting this access to park and disrupting the everyday use. So what it seems is that these issues with exclusivity of some of these large-scale music festivals are driven by, finances, basically. And this, together with some other related issues, is something that we are exploring further, and especially in these ongoing interviews. And we also look forward to developing and discussing and reporting later. So I guess, yeah, I'm going to stop now here.
Okay, thank you very much, Goran. That was great. We're going to move quickly to the final speaker from, or I'm going to speak after Michael, but we've got Michael Luckton, who's a PhD student at the Open University of Catalonia, and he's working with Dr. Alba Colombo, who's our PI in Barcelona, and has just joined the project. So he's just going to provide a little summary of what's been going on in Barcelona. Michael, can I hand over to you?
Okay, thank you, David. Alba wanted me to send her regards and her regrets for not being able to be here with you today. I hope I can provide a sufficient update to y'all on our project. So yeah, Alba's my supervisor. I'm a doctoral candidate here at the UOC. So our research here aims to identify the use of public urban space by diverse cultural events and festivals. And we want to observe their capacities to generate senses of belonging, inclusion, and how they can create social networks. So in addition to the main aims and research questions that are shared by the Festspace group here in Barcelona, we're looking for what kind of lasting effects beyond economic growth, such as social and cultural development, that some of these urban events and public spaces can have. We also want to analyze how different events can create different places in that same space, how an event in a public street or park or square, it can be more or less inclusive, more or less exclusive to different groupings of different people during different times of the year. So I'm here just to try and get you up to date on our progress with this grant. The first step that we've done is the creation of a database of Barcelona public space events. Now, Barcelona, it's a large city, it's really dense, and there's a lot of different neighborhoods. We worked closely together with the Ajuntament of Barcelona, the City Hall, interfacing with various cultural administration departments to come up with a database of almost 400 events through which we've defined a typology, and which we want to try and get out this idea of intensity in the use of public space. So this idea of intensity, calculating the use of intensity of a space, involves the crossing of variables such as frequency of use, the number of visitors and groups, the length of their use there. And some of these variables are harder to assemble than others. You know, for closed ticketed events, it's quite easy to look at your ticket sales to get an idea of attendance. But this is not always so clear with these outdoor events, you know, like the Parade of Kings that we have here in Barcelona. This is something that happens around Christmas time when the three kings arrive to the port of Barcelona, and then the next day they parade through the city streets, all sorts of different neighborhoods, all at the same time, and the kids of the neighborhood come and they bring their wish list, their gift list for what they want for Christmas to the kings. Just to be able to count the attendance of that is almost an impossibility. There's also some things that haven't been recorded. And it's interesting, in fact, that the city now, because of this collaboration that we've had with them, they've started to record the space of an event as a field in their database. So after we constructed our database by crossing the data that we got from several different departments in the city governments, we selected a couple case studies with criteria that we think will get us cases which are both representational of the use of public spaces in Barcelona, but also will have something interesting to tell us based on their uniqueness. So we have three main types in our typology that we've developed. The first type of event are traditional and popular events based upon Catalan culture. This would be like the Parade of Kings. It would also be like these Festes Majoris that happen in the different neighborhoods. So in fact, yeah, we further break down our typologies into two main categories. Within each typology, we have a category for an event that's citywide, and also those that just take place in a local neighborhood. The second main typology we got are these industry events. These are music festivals, film festivals, or even cultural industry market festivals, such as La Fiera del Libre, which is a large open air book fair that we have once a year. And the third event in our typology, the third type of event is cultural diversity events. And these are things like the Chinese New Year or like a Pakistani Day. So out of our database, and by looking at these typologies, looking at the length of the events, we wanted some that had been larger than, that had gone on for more than 25 years, some that had only been going on for less than 5 years. We selected 12 representational events, and we developed a survey to distribute. We plan to distribute that survey to both primary stakeholders and event participants. And we're conducting ethnographic participation observation by a series of different research teams. So at this point in time, we've developed this sophisticated database. We've designed our survey. We've distributed the survey to some people, and we're preparing our ethnographic teams for the coming year. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that at some point in time, events will happen again somewhere in the world, and hopefully it'll happen here in Barcelona, and we'll be able to have a really good study. But in closing, I want to go over quickly what we aim to do in the immediate future. So just here in September, we're developing an association with a geographer based here in Barcelona to develop some use maps to help us to describe and observe this type of intensity that we're talking about, to observe and analyze events based on typology, based on the neighborhood districts, and based on what kind of typology happens per district. And we're also trying to construct a different mapping that's not just geospatial, but it's also going to be diachronic, so that we can get an idea of how the public spaces are used by different groups at different times throughout the year.
Okay. That's great, Michael. Thank you very much for a very succinct summary, and great to have you on board of the project. I'm just going to finish this part of it just by just giving you an update on what we're doing in the context of Glasgow. Severan and Gail are also part of the project, and that's something common to all these projects. There's a larger research team working alongside the PIs for each of those. So, you know, just like we heard from other cities, you know, since the late 80s, early 90s, Glasgow's very much been committed to investing in culture, sport, and festivals and events as a way of kind of renewing the city. And obviously that's following the significant effects of kind of post-deindustrialization processes on the city. So we know of a large range of festivals and events that have been established over the last sort of 30 years and more. And also certain city spaces that have been used as the venues for these festivals and events. And I guess in our project, we've looked to explore a number of those festival and events and across a number of the spaces. And the sort of way we're thinking about this, the sort of events in the spaces, is that we have one focus on city centre events that occupy or take over or animate city streetscapes. You know, good examples of that are Merchant City Festival, Style Mile Carnival, that are kind of always used to drive people towards the retail outlets and towards the areas of the city centre from a business perspective. We're also interested in different sort of genres of festival and events that are both private and civic oriented, that take place in some of the city's parks. So Glasgow Greens, kind of close to the city centre, a big focus for festivals and events in the city of Glasgow, as is Kelvingrove Park. These host a variety of different types of festivals and events. So Glasgow Mela, Transmit, commercial music festival, fireworks display, like we heard about earlier, proms in the park. So very different genres, trying to target different types of groups in two main parks in the city. We're also increasingly focusing in on neighbourhood festivals and events, that are utilising local streetscapes and public green spaces for their activities. Good example is Govan Hill International Festival and Carnival, which is one that just happened actually, even though during COVID. A very specific kind of objective purpose for that community. I think that's becoming interesting for us in terms of our project. And finally, we've also just looked a little bit at commercial operations utilising sort of public buildings and their surrounds. Examples are Elfin Grove, which is held at the Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, actually run by a commercial operator, and Glasgow as well, which is another one that's using the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow. So these are the kind of the range of kind of spaces and festivals that we're looking at. In terms of what we've done to date, we've done a lot of work early on, pre-COVID, with looking at the kind of strategic context within which festivals and events are organised in the city, including the design, urban design dimension, the licensing, planning, etc. We've also, like Andrew and Goran, been doing quite in-depth observations, both across the events that I've mentioned, number of events there, and also across various spaces within event times and outside of event times. And we're working to a particular template where we're able to try and kind of capture and have some comparative dimension across the different types of events, but looking at broadly similar issues. And finally, in ours, we have an associate partner is in the urban design space, and so we've had access to be able to get close in to some sort of participatory design and planning processes in and around a couple of particular public spaces, and looked at the context within which festivals and events are discussed within those spaces. So we're looking at George Square in Glasgow, which is going through a kind of, has done in the past and has continued to go through a kind of a redesign or thought process around about redesign. And we're interested in how festivals and events are being articulated as part of that kind of redesign in terms of, it's a very much a kind of public facing exercise. And that's been really fascinating to hear how people see those kind of spaces, like a historic civic space, and what purpose it has, and what people see the value of festival and events within that context. Aware of Times, which is some sort of emergent, I guess, findings that's coming from the endeavours that we've undertaken to date. I mean, we're going to talk about COVID in a moment, but pre-COVID, certainly we were seeing an increased awareness and expressed concerns over the overuse of some public spaces for particular types of festivals and events in particular, and the sustainability of those spaces and those public spaces. So obviously we mentioned earlier a little bit about the Edinburgh controversy, which touches on that, but also we saw that through the George Square discussions. There's a big kind of conversation about George Square, and certainly a sense that certain types of, in particular, commercial events and events that close off, erect barriers, physical barriers as well as perhaps psychological barriers, were perceived to be problematic for citizens of the city who participated in this large conversation. So there's a growing sense that while, for the industry, hosting events in iconic spaces is desirable, there is a sense, I think, for wider public that these processes are becoming perhaps less satisfactory, and that's a challenge, changing during COVID, of course, because we've maybe gone over a peak event. Secondly, in the kind of context of the participatory design processes that we've been part of and seeing, festival and events are certainly part of the conversation in there, both in terms of the design of the space itself, whether that be a park, a streetscape, or a square, and also its animation or particularly its programming. And what we found, I guess, is in those spaces where oversupply of events and their impacts are felt more severely, then the public desires for more sensitivity towards issues of inclusivity, diversity, for example, and discussion about the most appropriate place for festival and events to take place. And in Glasgow, for example, there's a discussion about the development of an event spatial strategy, which begins to explore where certain types of festivals and events should take place, targeting which parts of the population, try to think about that a little bit more strategically, rather than it just being places that became attractive to event organisers to use, but maybe are not fitting as closely or aligning as closely with broader sort of city strategies. And in contrast, where supply is low and the kind of, I guess, renaissance or reimagination of the town or city is on the agenda, then we found that actually a programme of festivals and events is still seen as a very important means of activating public spaces and enlivening towns and neighbourhoods, and with the outcome of potentially bringing communities together. So there's that big difference between the size and scale in particular, and how people felt about it. And I guess finally, I think we found there's lots of policy rhetoric in particular around about festival and events being more inclusive and reflecting more equitable urban strategies, but that's yet, I think, to be translated into clear practices, processes, and evidence of how that actually is done or achieved. I think some interesting examples in Glasgow. Glasgow Mela is very much a kind of seen sometimes as a diversity festival, the festival of diversity. It's showcased there, it receives public funding. We're interested in looking at a contrasting festival, Govan Hill International Festival and Carnival, which is perhaps not well funded, not part of the state agenda really, but it's very much kind of focused on an anti-racism environment, works very closely with organisations all year round to foreground issues of tolerance and celebrate diversity in a particular community in Glasgow. And I think that's, I guess, making us interested in the extent to which some of those more locally rooted and organised and funded actually festivals and events can be perhaps more effective at promoting agendas of inclusivity, because they're actually less tied to specific instrumental citywide outcomes, and less showcased in that manner. So they have a kind of, I guess, an authenticity and a longer term kind of commitment that perhaps we don't always see with some of these more contrived or manufactured events. So that's a summary of where we are with Glasgow at the moment. Lots of things to do. Just in the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes, we just wanted to draw attention to how COVID has impacted on the research for the Festspace project. Obviously, you know, we wouldn't have imagined we were going to be doing a project focused on festival and events, and then had a year without festival and events. So COVID's clearly had a big impact. So maybe if I go back to Bernadette first to briefly talk about how COVID's impacted on the projects and the research you sought to achieve, and then maybe others can join in, and we can just summarise some of the impacts before we close.
How many minutes have I got?
Oh, two.
Go. Okay, COVID has affected us badly. I guess we were fortunate in that we had already gathered data from the public, as I already explained, but now we need to work out ways of dialoguing with the other actors that are involved. And hopefully we will be able to gather a lot of data just online, focus groups and interviews online. So that's probably going to be okay. One significant impact is that it did encourage us to change our line of inquiry ever so slightly. And over the summer, the major data gathering we have been doing has been talking to specifically the arts festival sector about how the pandemic has affected their workings. So we've been having interviews and holding focus groups with organisers, festival and event organisers on that theme, trying to work out how they have responded. Now that's produced data that's going to allow us now to start writing up firstly about how the creative sector has responded to the crisis. And we've seen tremendously creative and flexible responses. And it's actually begun to make me think about how this sector has responded relative to other sectors, because I actually think that the way this sector has responded has shown remarkable resilience and flexibility and agility. And it's making me think about, looking at the lessons that could be learned out of that, maybe for other sectors. And it's also generates some data on understanding how the sector has been supported by various government levels through the crisis. So that's something we've been doing over the summer, and that wasn't planned obviously at the outset of the project. So as we have been finding out how the festival sector has been responding, it's giving us new ideas now for developing our research going forward. So what we're seeing is that festivals are effectively finding new ways of creating space through which to engage with their audiences, and some of those are new audiences. So we now are going to follow those festivals, if you like, into the new spaces that they are creating in response to the situation that we find ourselves. So, via online methods. They are creating connectivity with cohorts of people and encouraging them to engage in different kinds of ways. So they're rethinking how and where they stage their work. And a lot of that is bringing us into more localized contexts. And it's also blurring the boundaries of public and private space. So it's encouraging us to think not so much solely about public space any longer, but to think about how public space is actually quite difficult to define, and how it moves and shifts and changes, and how it can be blurred. And there's quite a lot of literature on that, obviously. So we're thinking about that now. In addition, audiences are changing their behaviors, is something that we've been learning from our work over the summer. So, audiences are not static actors, they have agency, and they can decide how to engage with festivals. So that's really interesting. So we're trying to look at that as well. So, for example, small little thing, people are engaging with online events, but they're inviting friends around to their house to watch the event together, and creating public spaces inside their own private domains. So we're going to try and have a look at what's going on there. Now, key to gathering the data there, I think, will be to work closely with event and festival organizations with whom we have very good relationships. And it's going to be difficult, but I think that's going to get us through this and allow us to continue gathering data. If we have a good relationship, which we have with one or two festival organizations who, in a way, we have, in a way, unintentionally, we have almost been following an organization. It's like an ethnography of one or two event organizations, and how they have been negotiating this over time as the months go on. And we just go back to them every now and again and say, how's it going now, and where are you at now? So we didn't think we would be doing that. On the commemorative work front, which I didn't really talk about much, similarly, we're going to look at how planned events are being reimagined in the context of the pandemic. But rather than actually looking at the end product or the consumption of that event, we're really probably going to be looking more closely at the production of it, which will bring us into more localized contexts. So not the great big spectacle at the end of the day, but how it has been made and produced, and what all of that meant to the people who were making it, really. Because what we've been finding is a huge amount of investment in the making of those commemorative events, which are the ones we've been looking at are in local community hands. Tremendous amount of investment in terms of the meanings that we made there. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just aware of our time. I mean, one of the things that we certainly responded to in the Glasgow context was trying to understand what had been happening during COVID, which is one of the other things that we've tried to do quite a lot of, I think, on the project, is try and share insights into the spontaneous kind of events that sprung up, the kind of activities that communities did for themselves, often exploiting sometimes the fact that there was a relaxation of planning, and there was a relaxation of how public spaces are normally used, streets, for example. So you can find lots of that on the website. Also, we sort of did a little project called Stories from the Streets, which was trying to actually access digitally information from people about what actually happened in their communities, and try to sort of crowdsource that. And that's something that we're going to focus upon soon. Andrew and Goran, or Michael, I wonder if there's anything specific you want to say just on the impact of COVID on the research you've been able to do before we close?
No, very briefly. I mean, we were a bit like Bernadette. We were looking that we'd collected quite a lot of data in 2019, which we're almost now sort of trying to use as like a sort of peak event year, and try and then compare that with what's going to come after. Luckily, again, we've sort of delayed our online interviewing till the late summer, till now, effectively till June, July and August, so that those interviews can almost reflect a little bit back on this summer, which has been very different, and so the interviewees can almost compare last summer to this summer, and think about how the park events and what the lack of park events has affected the park, and what the implications might be for the future. So, and I think, I mean, like a lot of universities, our university is still not permitting field work of any description. So we can't even continue our sort of passive observation work in the park at the moment. We have to rely on sort of second-hand accounts. So we heard from Anna and other people, Louise and other people today, about sort of more hybrid internet-based methods, and we're going to have to use a lot more of those now in terms of recording what happened over the last few months and what might happen over the next months, because at the moment we can't actually physically witness what's happening in our key case study space. The other thing we're planning to do, again, it sounds like a little bit of a cheat, but because there's a long history of festivals and events in our case study, we want to go back and look at what happened, you know, in the 90s and even back further than that. So we're almost going to add a historical dimension that we weren't going to do previously, partly to compensate for the fact that we're not probably able to do as detailed a ethnographic case study as we were originally hoping to do. But it's very interesting times, like you say. In some ways, there's a whole new research project which is all about, you know, what a public space is like without events, and do people miss them, and what's missing, and how is this absence being felt. And financially, for London's parks, become very reliant on higher fees for events, and therefore the lack of that type of funding is going to be very significant. So, but we've almost been a little bit careful not to just go fully into that, because that's almost a new project in itself.
I think in Glasgow, just quickly, there's been, because there's major sort of work being done about rethinking the city centre, the whole city centre in Glasgow. And I think one of the things that's come out of this is, as the design work and the thinking around about design is happening during COVID, then there's a real sense of understanding the kind of underutilised or unused spaces in communities, in particular in localities, and that kind of real focus on locality as opposed to the big spectacles, and actually a recognition that communities need spaces, but they also need things to do in and around spaces to make their neighbourhoods
and the festival, the festival I've just been attending this weekend in Greenwich, actually the explicit intention was to take outdoor theatre and other events to people's doorsteps. So they actually were doing stuff in various estates. They were doing stuff on basketball courts, and, you know, their performance spaces were completely altered, because they were all saying, well, hang on, you know, we don't want everyone gathering in these large central spaces. We're going to take smaller events, but take them to neighborhoods and let them consume them more locally. So yeah, I think that is a really interesting little micro trend that we could all have a look at.
Michael, is there anything final you might want to just add, and then maybe hand back to Andrew to close?
You know, I think we have a unique vantage point, and we haven't really done a lot of our field work yet, but it's still far off in the future that there's a good chance that we could have some really positive interviews and field work there. And from an interesting vantage point of people who are just getting back and experiencing these festivals after there being this sudden cessation of activities. And also we can conduct these ethnographic studies online should these festivals continue to go online. So on the one hand, we didn't have the opportunity to get our ethnographic studies done beforehand, but we also weren't caught in this sort of, well, at least not yet, we haven't been caught in that sort of no man's land of having our events canceled. And there's a good chance, at least here, it feels like that events and life will continue on in some sort of way. We have to have events. It's, when Bernadette talked about the effects on the sector, I think that it's one effect that I think that it's had is it's made it clear the importance of event just to the human condition, you know, that you need it for cities, you need it for society, you need it for community. And it's something that we'll make, whether we make it virtual in the space of flows or whether we make our spaces in public spaces. That's where we are with regards to our research, but, you know, just in case, we're also looking at how things evolved in COVID-19, like the way that there was a lot of these sort of balcony festivals that happened here. And that's something that we're looking into and writing a paper about and looking to explore along as a Festspace project advances.